Part 3 of Commander and the King, an Easter Story. Part 3, we've labeled A Shocking Confession. And Manny, I'm assuming the recordings are up. Just stop me if they're not, but I'm going to go on as though everything is up and running. Okay, part 3 of the Commander and the King, an Easter Story. Part 3 is a shocking confession. If you remember from part 2, we had left off with the tribune commander having spoken with Paul, heard the name of Jesus Christ, and remembering that his old training officer, Jago, from decades before, had had a run-in with Jesus Christ that had somehow resulted in a major twist in his career. And with Jago having wound up in the same city as the tribune commander, then the tribune commander had decided to go see him to learn what he could about Jesus Christ, because Paul had said that Jesus Christ was the reason for all the hatred and rioting towards him in the city. A quick message to my intelligence officer ascertained for me the neighborhood and likely street where Jago lived. While I could make a high-profile official visit to him, guards and all, the man seemed not to want any obvious connection to me. If he was intentionally staying private about his past, my showing up in full regalia would cause him trouble. Maybe his neighbors knew nothing of his past. It was my job to keep peace in the city. For the second time that evening, I stripped off my armor and considered how to blend in, this time on the local streets. I selected my most basic tunic, and as it was evening, I took advantage of the opportunity to wear a cloak. Underneath my cloak, I slipped a pugio, the dagger we officers sometimes carried as small sidearms. I was taking a risk, going into the city alone and without armor. I wouldn't go unarmed. I informed the centurion on duty that I was occupied for the evening on important business in the city and not to expect me back until late. I told my bodyguards to take the evening off. They didn't argue with the unexpected gift of a little free time. Unknown and alone, I walked quietly through the colonnade, past the temple, and slipped through the archway into the streets of Lower Jerusalem. While I almost never entered the city by myself, I knew it well after having lived here for years. It was still relatively early in the evening, at least by Jerusalem's standard. Nights were welcome relief from the hot days. Evening meals were taken late this time of year. Jago's reported neighborhood was past the stadium. My information said I would find him on the street closest to the Central Valley, across from the Pool of Siloam. It was a pleasant walk this direction and would be significantly uphill on the way back. As I neared where I knew Jago should live, a few coins and a few questions to likely-looking locals soon had me directed to a particular unassuming door, behind which I was told there would be a courtyard, off which Jago had a room. I wasn't sure what to expect Jago's neighbors to think of him, but the energetic boy who was assigned to escort me through the door spoke of Jago like a friend. Perhaps there had been a mistake and I had the wrong Jago? While the boy went to fetch Jago from one of the rooms off the ground floor, I stood awkwardly in the pleasant little courtyard where chickens scratched, a goat dozed, an old woman gazed placidly at me, and a toddler played in the dirt near her feet. The prospect of suddenly meeting Jago in the flesh presented me with an unexpected pang of anxiety. Stop it, I told myself. You're not a naive youth anymore. You technically outrank him. I took a steadying breath and waited. Perhaps he was out? Would I have to sit here and wait? The young man scampered out of a darkened doorway and darted away. Following through the door was unmistakably Jago. He wasn't a huge man. Indeed, I was taller than he. but he was solidly built, with a thick neck and a large bald head. The years weighed on him, but he still carried himself with unhurried confidence. He wore a beard now. He approached me, extending a hand in greeting. His voice had dried out with age and resonated with more warmth than I remembered. "Good evening. How can I help you?" Jago stopped suddenly. His mouth opened and closed once or twice as recognition sunk in. "Hello, Jago. Lysias." He recovered a little from his astonishment and grinned with a shake of his head. "Lysias, and now Claudius Lysias, the tribune commander." There was no mockery in his voice, maybe even a hint of pride. "How good to see you. How did you know I was here?" I suddenly realized my nervousness had been silly. Jago was going on old age, living a quiet life. Had I been expecting him to yell at me, berate me, try to fight me? Seeing his surprise and genuine delight in my visit, I relaxed. "It's good to see you too, Jago." I meant it. "Where's your bodyguard, your entourage?" He looked past me like he expected to see horses and a detachment of soldiers in the street. "Just me, I'm afraid. Sort of incognito, you could say. I was hoping we could talk." "You and me?" Jago looked puzzled, but he had enough soldier sense to know what was being asked of him. He gestured me towards a sloped ladder. "The roof. It's quiet up there. Have you eaten?" I suddenly realized I hadn't eaten more than a few hurried bites since morning. The uproar at the Sanhedrin felt like it had been a week ago. "Not much," I confessed. "Good. Go up both ladders and wait for me there. I'll bring something for us." I'd never known Jago had a hospitable bone in his body, but he strode back across the courtyard and bent through a doorway I assumed led into the common kitchen. As he passed her, the old woman started to rise, but he motioned her back down. I ascended the ladders, which saved room versus stairs in this crowded part of the city. On the roof, I moved towards the back of the house, the side overlooking the central valley which ran through the city. Jago was right. It was quiet up here, even with the houses packed in tightly. Low walls and a sheltering lattice of woven leaves protected a simple table with cushions around it. I gazed across the narrow valley, which ran through the heart of the city, to the walled old city of David, less than a bowshot away. I'd never seen it from this angle before. David was a legendary king who had conquered this city nearly 1,000 years ago and had ruled the whole area with a powerful army. I wondered what he would have made of me, a general in an army he'd never heard of, occupying his city. Jago's footsteps behind me checked my wandering thoughts. His arms were full, and I wondered how he'd navigated the ladders. He hurried over and set down an earthen pot, followed by a basket, a jug, and a stack of bowls. From the pot, I could smell something warm and savory. "Sit, sit," Jago urged me. I obeyed and reclined on one of the low cushions by the table. He unloaded the items on the table and brought over a basin of water for me to wash my hands. I guessed they ate up here often. Jago set 2 bowls in front of me and filled one with stew from the pot and the other with wine from the jug. He held the basket out to me, and I gratefully took a small loaf of flatbread, cooled but not stiff, and some fresh dates. Jago filled his own bowls and settled opposite me. Just as I was about to begin eating, he surprised me by looking up, either towards the sky or the temple, I wasn't sure, and saying a prayer in Hebrew. I looked questioningly at him as he finished, and he simply shrugged and picked up his stew and bread. I followed suit eagerly. The food was simple and delicious. Jago allowed me to eat for a few minutes in silence and then observed, "Well, Lysias, you haven't gotten fat, but you still eat like you're doing your best." I glanced up mid-chew, and he laughed. "Relax. There's nothing wrong with enjoying good food. It's my honor to share it with you. Have some more." Against my unconvincing protests, he refilled my bowl of stew and topped off my wine. I took the second portion more slowly. When my stew was gone, I took a long, refreshing drink of the wine and bit into a date. I confess I had no idea what to expect coming to see you. Jago nodded. I continued. I definitely didn't expect this kind of reception and delicious meal. Thank you. Jago nodded again. In fairness, I didn't expect to be having a second supper tonight with the Tribune commander on my own roof. Next time, give me a little warning, and I'll have something more luxurious than lentil stew, as I'm sure you're accustomed to richer fare. Not at all. I waved off another refill. It was perfect. Jago reclined back into his cushion, looking at me expectantly. It was time to tell him why I'd barged in unannounced after the two of us living in the same city for years. I began with the facts. There was a riot by the temple yesterday. The Jewish council was trying to kill a man. I took him prisoner, and this morning I presented him to the council at the Sanhedrin for formal charges. They rioted again, this time in the Hall of Hewn Stones. I thought they were going to tear him apart. I looked up to make sure he was following. Jago drained his bowl of wine and smacked his lips. Would that prisoner be Paul, Saul of Tarsus? He asked. I rolled my eyes. How does everyone seem to know more than I do about this guy? Do you know him? Jago waved his hands, indicating sort of, but not really. I know who he is for sure. I've heard him speak and teach, but I don't think he would know me. He's a remarkable man. He's been a remarkable thorn in my side these last couple of days, I quipped cynically. But seriously, I wouldn't have expected you would have anything in common with him. Jago chewed slowly on a date and stared at me meaningfully. So your coming to talk to me out of the blue has nothing to do with Paul? I find that hard to believe. Yes, me too, I mumbled. I exhaled a long breath, gazing past Jago at the old city of David. Jago, what happened the first time you left Jerusalem, right after you trained me in Caesarea? Jago stiffened. His eyes flicked side to side, and for a terrible moment I saw a shadow of the old Jago, Jago the grim, darken his brow. I'd said too much. Look, you don't have to... I started to back down from my question. It's okay. Jago softened, and the rising knot in my chest subsided. I think I know what you're getting at. Listen, you tell me what this has to do with Paul, and I'll tell you what happened to me 20 years ago. Fair? Fair, I agreed. But off the record, Paul's legal case isn't determined. Jago assented. Earlier this evening, I went to see Paul privately, trying to get a better idea why the council hates him so much and wants him executed. I couldn't make head or tail of their accusations this morning. Paul told me, he told me they don't hate him, they hate who he serves. When I asked him to clarify, he said he serves Jesus Christ, who he says is a powerful king, and the men in the council rejected Jesus or something like that, so they want to kill Paul for serving him. I stopped, unsure where to go from there. Jago chuckled. That does sound like Paul. That guy gets chased out of cities everywhere from what I hear, and it's always about Jesus. Jago, is he crazy? This guy has all kinds of credentials, but he bears scars of severe floggings, and I've never seen a reaction to anyone like he seems to elicit practically every time he opens his mouth near the Jewish leaders. Jago narrowed his eyes at me. Nope. You still haven't told me what this has to do with me. A deal's a deal. I winced. I'd been hoping to flank the question rather than addressing it head on again. Look, Paul says this is all about Jesus Christ. I know he was in Jerusalem when you were, and Jago prompted me. And there were rumors you had some kind of run-in with Jesus, and that he had something to do with why you were sent from Jerusalem and ultimately to Britain. And I need the real story on Jesus so I can figure out how to keep the city from rioting every time Paul or someone like him shows up. I am Claudius's authority here. I have to keep the peace. If this man Jesus, if his name causes executions and uprising, I bloody well figure out what it all means before I lose control of the whole city and wind up exiled somewhere or worse. Jago slapped the table, startling me. I looked at him sharply. Was that so hard? He asked. What's so hard? I was befuddled. The truth. You don't have to dance around it. I'm not your enemy. The truth is strength, even if you think it makes you weak, especially when it makes you weak. I thought about what he'd said. I did feel better having laid out the truth of why I was here and what I was afraid of. Well, that's the truth. I reached for the jug of wine and refilled my bowl. Your turn, Jago. A deal's a deal. Jago grinned at me. Better drink up that wine, son. You want to know about my encounter with Jesus? I'll tell you. I'll tell you the truth, and then we'll see who you think is crazy. Jago refilled his own bowl of wine and settled more comfortably into his cushion. I could see him taking on the attitude of rolling banter smattered with slang and run-ons, the way we soldiers spoke when we told stories. Jago hemmed and mumbled for a moment about where to begin. Then he extended his arm to the northwest, pointing up the hill and across the rooftops of his neighborhood. The first time I saw Jesus Christ up close was over there, in the courtyard by Herod's palace. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor at the time, stayed there near Herod when he wasn't in Caesarea. I was working directly for Pilate at the time. He wanted me to oversee training for new troops, but they hadn't arrived, so I was mostly filling in wherever I was needed. Bright and early that morning, a bunch of Jews, the council, the chief priest Caiaphas, and a whole crowd of them showed up at Pilate's door, demanding an execution. It turns out they'd had some kind of trial during the night, which was probably illegal by their own law, and they decided this man Jesus had to die. Of course, Roman law outranked their law, so public executions had to be carried out by Romans. What I'm saying is, they had to convince Pilate to have Jesus executed, which was where things started to get weird because Jesus had a reputation for being a pretty good guy, helping out the poor and all that, teaching about being good. I guess he kind of made the Jewish leaders look bad and they'd had enough. So there we are, first thing in the morning, and I'm acting as part of Pilate's bodyguard, and of course the Jews won't even come inside the main hall. It was their Passover time, and they were trying to remain holy. I guess holiness had nothing to do with executions. I was there when Jesus was brought in for Pilate to question him. Jesus was in pretty rough shape. The Jewish council must have knocked him around quite a bit during their so-called trial. Anyway, I'm trying to keep things under control while Pilate's going back and forth between Caiaphas and the Jewish elders outside while Jesus is still inside. It's ridiculous. Jesus and Pilate talked a little bit, and I don't know exactly what was said, but I know Jesus confirmed he was a king. But Jesus said his kingdom wasn't of this world. Pilate's getting kind of freaked out by the whole thing, and that wasn't like him at all. Pilate even tried to send Jesus over to Herod for the trial, something about Jesus being in Herod's jurisdiction, but Herod sent him back dressed all fancy like a king, which would have been pretty funny if it wasn't so dark. See, the whole thing was about Jesus being some kind of king of the Jews, king not of this world, and I guess nothing makes people angry more effectively than saying you're rightfully in charge of them when they don't want it. The Jews couldn't ignore him. They wanted him dead. It was like this bizarre comedy, you know? Jesus beat up pretty good before he even got there, being shuffled around dressed like royalty. Pilate and Herod sending messages back and forth, joking about whether or not this guy's really a king. And the Jews aren't having it. They're just demanding Jesus be executed. But you can't really execute a guy just for saying he's a king, right? I mean, it's not like he'd committed any kind of treason or even said anything about overthrowing Herod or Caesar. Herod, who'd been scared of the rumors of it before, thought the guy was a joke when Jesus actually stood in front of him. Why bother killing the guy at all? Finally, Pilate's had enough, you know. He wants the Jews to put their money where their mouth is. So he tells them to choose between Jesus and this really bad criminal who'd already been convicted. Which one do they want released? I tell you, they chose the criminal, some thieving murderer, over Jesus. That's hate right there. And it was getting out of control. Now half the city's outside Pilate's house calling for Jesus' death. And every time Pilate tries to reason with them, they get louder. I guess Pilate decides their blood is up and there's nothing to be done but give them a show. Here, Jago got quiet for a moment. Even though it was too dark now to see it, Jago still gazed towards Herod's palace, talking like I was hardly there. I was transfixed. When he started to go on with the story, Jago's voice caught and he had to clear his throat to get his words out. It was bad, man. Bad. I mean, I've seen some stuff and I know you have too, but this was just the worst. I guess because Jesus just took it, he just took it. And that dignity of his made all the ugly come bubbling right up on inside everybody, spilling out in a mess. So Pilate tells me and the guards to put on a show, give the Jews something to settle them down, really crank up the comedy, So we call all the soldiers together inside and we just got caught up in the whole situation. Jesus, he was still all dressed up like a king, so we put this nasty crown on him made of those big old thorns, We gave him a stick like a scepter and just made a big production of him being this king, a Jewish king, of course, bowing and mocking and all that. And the men were really into it. They'd spit on him and crack him on the head with a stick, and the thorns were making the blood run all down his face. And, I was part of it. Cheering the men on, making jokes, pushing Jesus around, thumping him some. I spit on him and he suddenly, Jesus just looked at me like he knew me or something, right at me. No anger, no challenge, just looking at me while I spit on him and knock him around. I tell you what, that look from him, it was like nothing ever made me so mad in my life. We were going to flog him, of course, right there in front of the whole battalion. When he looked at me, it was like something in me snapped. I ripped the fancy clothes off him, shoved him real hard over to the post, and grabbed one of those whips and just started wailing on him. The whole place was going crazy, and Jago's voice caught again. I was so stunned I'd barely been breathing. I knew Jago was a hard man. I'd never seen him even hint at losing control. In my mind, he'd forever been the consummate combat soldier, even a leader of men. Hearing this from him and seeing what it was doing to him, to tell it to me, I wanted it to end. Jago's jaw was clenched and his hand trembled as he reached for his bowl. Jago. My throat felt uncomfortably tight. I breathed and tried again. Jago, I understand. You don't have to go on. It makes sense now why you had to leave Jerusalem. Jago looked at me with some confusion. Then he raised a hand to cut me off. The truth, Lysias. Remember? Also, you don't understand yet. There's a lot more, and you need to know it. I nodded and spread my palms, encouraging him to go on if he wanted to, though I could see where this was going, and I didn't know why I needed to hear it. I knew Jesus had been executed. I'd seen my own fair share of executions. Maybe Jago just needed to tell the story, get it off his chest, and I was as good a listener as any, I supposed. Jago inhaled and picked up where he'd left off. I guess we delivered the flogging of all floggings. Before we really went too far, I remembered Pilate had said, put on a show, not take him inside and beat him to death. After all, this was for the Jews, right? So we got Jesus on his feet and put one of his absurd king robes back on him, and we bring him out to Pilate, who I'm pretty sure had a good idea what was going on with all the noise we've been making in there. I tell you what, Pilate sees Jesus flogged to ribbons and all bashed up, thorns stuck on his head and bleeding through that purple robe. Pilate looks like he's seen a ghost. I reminded him he told us to make a spectacle out of Jesus. So Pilate takes Jesus back outside to the Jews, and he starts yelling at them to look at him. Look at him. Look at the man. Look at your king. Like that. I think he was figuring enough was enough or something like that. Well, the Jews don't think so. They start screaming for a crucifixion. Not just an execution, mind you, a full-on crucifixion. Jesus is standing there in front of them, looking like he shouldn't be able to stand at all. The Jews are practically rioting for a crucifixion. Pilate's yelling at the Jews that he can't find anything wrong with Jesus. And just when you think this sick comedy can't get any darker, Caiaphas, the high priest, yells at Pilate that Jesus has to die according to their law because he claimed to be the Son of the Most High God. The Son of God. Not only a king, not even a king from out of this world, but the king, the literal God King, King of Kings. Pilate was uncomfortable before. He's a mess now. He takes Jesus back inside to try and get Jesus to tell him where he's really from, like Pilate's going to pull rank and save his life. And Jesus tells Pilate that Pilate's authority is nothing. And the way he says it makes so much sense. Pilate can't even respond. At this point, Pilate wants nothing to do with this. He tells the Jews as much. They demand a proper Roman crucifixion. And Jesus, he's literally made no defense. He's not denying a thing they say. He's just standing there quietly like a king being executed for no crime. What's Pilate going to do? He tells the Jews it's tantamount to murder. It's on them. And he actually brings out water and washes his hands in front of them. Then he sends us soldiers to give the Jews what they want. Crucify the guy. Look, this whole thing, it's like the world's gone mad. The soldiers and I are kind of over it at this point. I guess we thought we'd wore our ugly out with the flogging, and now we're just going through the motions. Real cynical, but hyped up because we're in the middle of a riot. But the Jews, they're not done. Right before we go, Pilate kind of one-ups Herod's fancy robe stunt from earlier. He tells us that we're going to hang Jesus on his cross under a sign labeling him as King of the Jews. Not just for the Jews, but in every main language. So everyone walking by for hours on that road going in and out of the city will see him there dying, King of the Jews, on display for the whole world. And the thing is, it's funny. We're laughing it up. One big bleeding barrel of grisly laughs. Welcome to humanity. We're all in it together, Might as well laugh it up while you're here because life's a joke and then you die. Hey, look over here, everybody. Here's the king of us all, and he's dying. You know why? You want the punchline? The best part? He's dying because we're killing him. We had to kill him because he's the only one not laughing. What a riot! Jago, who'd been half shouting this last part, fell silent. He certainly wasn't laughing. He looked sick. That made two of us. The nauseating joke went right down into us both and settled in its own little pool of bile. Jago grimaced and pushed his wine bowl away. He spoke quietly, the vinegar gone from his voice. So, Jesus dies. It takes hours, of course. That's the whole point of the crucifixion, right? He's up there with two other criminals, and it's all just the worst thing. The Jews are all standing around mocking him, but not to him, to each other, like they're encouraging each other. The other people, even the criminals up there with them, get in on it. Jesus, he just takes it. He doesn't say much. But you know what he does say? He says, and I heard it plain as day, he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't understand what they're doing. He says it to God like he's talking to his dad. That was enough for me, man. That was enough. The joke was over for me. I think it was over for everybody because things got real weird from there. Not the people, everything else. It got all dark and cold. We had this earthquake all of a sudden. Everybody was freaking out. By this time, Jesus is dead. We stuck him with a spear to be sure because you don't leave an execution half done. It's like everything agreed a God had just died. So the funny has turned to freaky, and the Jews have all beat it, and nobody wants to be there anymore. I went back to the barracks, and as soon as I was off duty, I can tell you I got blind drunk. Last thing I remember seeing sober was the moon all blood red in the sky. What else do you do after something like that? I didn't want to remember it, any of it. That's just how we dealt with stuff like that. Another silence. I broke it. I'm sorry, Jago. Sorry I asked you to relive all that. It sounds like something Anybody would want to forget, but thanks for helping me understand about Jesus and what happened to him. Then Jago chuckled. I turned to the unexpected sound, and Jago was shaking with quiet laughter, like I'd just fallen for a good joke. Jago, you okay? He wheezed a little and wiped his eyes. Lysias, I'm not done. The crucifixion didn't get me kicked out of Jerusalem. I was just doing my job. It's what happened next, and I think it'll help you answer your little problem with Paul. I'd almost forgotten about Paul. Shaking my head, all I could say was, well, I don't follow, but it's your story, so tell me what could possibly have you laughing now? Something you did while you were drunk? Jago rolled his eyes. No, Lysias, drunk or sober, I'm a professional. Be quiet and listen. I made it sound like every single person was against Jesus. But while nobody came to his defense, they didn't all want him dead. Some rich guy had taken Jesus' teaching seriously and wanted to give him a proper burial in a nice new tomb cut right into the rock, like a cave with a big boulder fitted into the mouth of it to close it up. In fact, one of the more prominent members of the Jewish council, Nicodemus, helped pay for a full-on set of spices, linen wrappings, and everything. Like I said, Jesus had really gotten through to some people while he was alive. Of course, I didn't really know or care at the time. All I knew was that the Jews kept bugging Pilate. It wasn't enough that Jesus was dead. They wanted to fully crush the spirits of anybody who'd ever believed him. I guess they were worried his tomb would become some kind of rallying point for his followers, or somebody would try and take Jesus' body and hide it, or something weird. So they got Pilate to put a round-the-clock squad of Roman sentries on the tomb. What? I interrupted. Guards for a dead man's body? It's not like it was some kind of royal procession funeral. I trailed off, realizing the awkward reference I'd accidentally made to Jesus' being buried like a king. I resolved to keep my mouth shut. As I was saying, Jago pushed forward with the narrative, the tomb is formally guarded day and night, and yours truly, not yet having a proper job, gets assigned to lead one of the shift rotations. Here, I helped kill an innocent man, and now I'm standing in front of his grave for hours every day like I'm protecting him from someone. I guess Pilate was unimpressed with how I'd handled the flogging and wanted to give me some time to think. And you know what? I did think. Killing Jesus had felt like a lot more than a typical execution. I didn't like how I'd acted, how I'd been so beastly. I wanted to step up my attitude. A few days into the guard rotation, I and my 4 guys are assigned to fourth watch, the last part of the night. Yeah, everyone's favorite. So we're standing there trying to keep warm, watching the sky start to turn a little gray and wondering what time it is, the usual last watch joys. I remember I could just hear the next shift talking as they were heading in from the road to relieve us, and, Lysias, are you with me? I sat up straight. I'd been hanging on every word, trying to guess where Jago was going with this. Yeah, totally with you. Good, because this is where it gets real out there. He cocked an eyebrow at me, knowing the story had already been a doozy. He had my full attention, and he knew it. There I am, in front of that tomb, my mind drifting to breakfast, and suddenly the ground jumps right under my feet. It's another earthquake, but intense. I can hardly stand up. And then there's this call like trumpets, like a shout, but way louder. I looked at Jago sharply. What? Who was trumpeting in the middle of an earthquake? Jago looked pained. Lysias, be quiet. This is hard to explain. I raised my hands in mute surrender. The ground is shaking. The air is ringing in the sky. All I can say is the sky kind of unrolls, opens up, and there's this crazy bright light behind it. Brighter than lightning, but just steady, not flashing or anything, more focused than the sun. My guys, they're beyond freaked out, and I guess you could say I was too. Now stay with me here, because it gets worse. Worse, I half shouted. Jago, this isn't making sense. Jago flapped a hand at me, shushing me. Stop complaining, Lysias. You weren't even there. I had to live through it. And there's no way to really get it right. Because the next thing that happened is a man, or something like a man, like a god, right off Olympus or something, but all pure and bright, just more, you know? Well, this man, this being, he comes out of the bright light, not like a bird. He just kind of descends, like he's being lowered on the beams of light. He comes down from the sky, right down to where we are, mostly on our hands and knees after losing our balance in the earthquake. Jago glanced uncomfortably at me. I stared at him, mouth agape. That glowing, radiating man, he totally ignores us, practically steps right over me. Jago shifted again. I didn't move a muscle. He goes over to the tomb, and all by himself, puts his arms around the boulder, sealing up the mouth of the tomb, lifts it out, and rolls it off to the side. Lysias, that boulder took 6 men with poles a quarter hour to move into place when Jesus was buried in there. But this man from the sky, he just moves it out of the way like an empty barrel. And call me a liar if you want, but Jesus walks out of the tomb. The shining man bows low to Jesus, and Jesus greets him like they're pals from back home. They're happy to see each other. And don't try to tell me it wasn't Jesus who walked out of the tomb, because it was. He wasn't dead or some ghost. He was alive, radiating like his friend, and also looking solid enough to move boulders. Lysias, I know it was Jesus. He wasn't injured anymore, and he had on a fresh robe, but I could see the scars where he put the nails through him. He was living, recovered in his same body that we'd very thoroughly killed, but healed and alive. So anyway, that's when I passed out. Don't judge me, Lysias. Every soldier there passed out. At least I didn't wet my tunic like half of them did. I don't know how long I was out, but I don't think it was long. When I came to, Jesus had gone, but his friend from above the sky was still there, sitting up on the boulder, just kind of enjoying the morning. I could see 2 of my guys staggering out of the garden. I kicked the remaining 2 until they came around, and we all beat it. We ran into the other soldiers who'd been on their way in to replace us. They'd also seen the whole thing. We were like a bunch of schoolboys repeating ourselves and interrupting each other, all telling our own parts of the impossible thing we'd just seen. Then it kind of dawned on us that we'd all just abandoned our post, and none of us was going back there while that shining man was sitting on the boulder by the empty tomb. We decided to use the old strength in numbers strategy and go explain what happened. We argued some about who we should tell first, and in the end, we went and woke up our centurion. Of course, he didn't want to believe us, but how do you argue with 10 of your own men all swearing on their mother's graves? So he took us to the leading Jews who demanded a guard there in the first place. The Jewish elders and Caiaphas himself, the very Jews I'd seen at Jesus' crucifixion, I told them exactly what happened. Now, Lysias, here's what gets me. They knew I was telling the truth. What do you think they did? Caught completely off guard by the question, I fumbled for an answer. Well, if I killed a guy for claiming to be a god king, and then I'd heard beyond doubt that he'd walked out of his tomb like he was exactly that, a man-god king, I guess I'd be rethinking my original position, kind of regretting I'd called for his crucifixion. Maybe I'd be thinking of leaving town. Why? What did they say to you? Jago leaned back, folded his hands behind his head, and smiled with satisfaction. Think about it, Lysias. They'd seen the weirdness at the crucifixion, felt the earthquake that morning, and I heard them talking about other scary stuff that had happened, like holy parts of the temple opening up when Jesus died. More, too. Apparently, Jesus had done all kinds of miracles while he was alive, and he'd literally told them he would rise from the dead when, not if, but when they eventually killed him. They knew all along this might happen, but they weren't freaked out like we were. My mind was reeling. Wait, Jago, hold up there. If they knew this might happen, if they knew Jesus might be exactly what he'd been claiming to be, why would they kill him at all? That just doesn't make sense. Ah, but it does. Jago shook a finger at me. Consider what I've told you. Think about every political assassination you've ever heard of in Rome. When do you kill a king? I thought about it for a moment. When you won his throne. I was starting to get his point. Exactly. You don't kill every guy who wishes he was a king. Everyone wants to be a king. You don't kill the ones who even go so far as to say they would be a better king, because most people believe that about themselves too. You certainly don't kill the people who want you to be king or who are glad to rule alongside you and help protect your throne. The real threat to the throne you want is the actual, legitimate king who can prove he's the real king. You can never have the throne so long as he's alive. He's the one you have to kill. So, I was putting the pieces together. They didn't kill Jesus because he was a false king. They killed him because he was a true king. Precisely. And I'd just seen that true king walk out of his tomb. No way could they have me or any of the rest of us spreading that story. So they paid us to keep our mouths shut about the truth. But there was no body in the tomb. So we'd all have to say Jesus' followers stole it. Of course, that would mean constant rumors that we'd all failed as guards, been derelict, which, as a Roman soldier, you know, means death. So the only solution was to have all of us sent far, far away. So that's why you had to leave Jerusalem. Yes, looking like a disgraced soldier. Jago shrugged. My military career was over in terms of promotions. It sounded so unfair to me. So what happened then? I asked. Well, their cover-up didn't work. Jesus was alive. There was no body to prove otherwise, and the tomb was empty. Moreover, Jesus walked and talked with all kinds of people for a while, even ate and drank with them. Then he went back to heaven. He promised he'd be back, returning as a true, victorious, conquering king. I stared at Jago, trying to process what he just said. I couldn't, and it wasn't what I'd been asking. Sorry, Jago, I meant, what happened to you? Oh, well, that's less exciting. I mean, how do you just sort of go on with your life after doing what I'd done and seeing what I'd seen? I tried to drink my way out of it, fight my way out of it, suffer my way out of it, but it got real bad. Every time I struck a blow on the battlefield, I remember Jesus looking at me when I'd struck him and spit on him. Every time I drank too much, I was back at the crucifixion trying to forget what I'd done. Every time I shouted at somebody in cruelty, I was yelling at Jesus while he looked at me, blood on his face from the thorns in his head. Every poor enemy I victimized, I was swinging the whip down at Jesus' naked back. I was just crucifying him, flogging him over and over again. I was a mess. I could only imagine. How do you get a handle on it? Well, it wasn't much good as a soldier. I could fight in battle, of course, but the other men were scared of me. They didn't want anything to do with me. And I was miserable. Then, one day, it dawned on me. I had to quit running from it. If Jesus was really alive, as I'd seen him, I'd find him and do whatever it took to make it right. Let him flog me if he wanted to. Put myself on a cross if I had to. Anything to make amends, so long as I didn't have to go on living as a guilty wretch. So I left the military, went full civilian as best I could, and headed back here to Jerusalem. I wanted to find Jesus' followers and learn what had happened after the resurrection. When I got here and started asking around, I was pretty quickly introduced to Jesus' actual brother, James. Whoa, Jesus had a brother? Has a brother, a half-brother, but that's a longer story. James is a really good man. He takes care of Jesus' followers here in Jerusalem. Anyway, when I met him and told him who he was, I threw myself at his feet, sobbing and begging for forgiveness for what I'd done to Jesus. He wept with me, but you know what? He actually forgave me. Even more, he helped get me involved with Jesus' followers around the city, and now I'm very much one of them. What do you mean you're one of his followers? How do you follow a man who's not here anymore? Jago looked at me for a long moment before answering. Here's the thing, Lysias. Once you know Jesus is the true king, the real, living King of Kings, you either accept his kingship or you keep trying and failing to crucify him so you can have his throne for yourself. You either make Jesus your king or you keep killing him wherever you find him. See? I was sick of crucifying him, sick with myself as king. So I told Jesus that and asked him to be my king instead. He's God. You can talk to him and he hears you. Suddenly, I was distinctly uncomfortable. Jago was telling me, like Paul, that he served Jesus as a true reigning king. Jago, no offense, but what makes you think Jesus wants you as a servant after what you did to him? It's a fair question, Jago acknowledged. I wrestled with it myself. But remember how Jesus wasn't resisting what I did to him, not fighting back or trying to get out of it. I've learned since then that it was prophesied hundreds of years ago, all sorts of ways, that God would come take our punishment for all our ugliness in our place and offer us righteousness in exchange if we'd have him as king. He was taking my ugliness on himself, letting me give it to him, so that he could forgive me and welcome me into his kingdom. Imagine that, Lysias. A king who would pay your debts infinitely so you can serve him out of love instead of guilt or fear. Who ever heard of such a thing? What if we don't accept him as king? What then? Here, Jago stood and stretched, looking around at the horizon. I was surprised to see dawn approaching in the east. We'd been here all night. Jago stared over at the ancient portion of the city where King David had once ruled. Lysias, what do you think a rightful king does to those who try to murder him, murder his servants, and take his throne for themselves? Say he's out of town for a while, but then he comes back and knows what his usurpers tried to accomplish and what they did to his loyalists while he was gone. What happens then? I'd say it gets pretty ugly, even if he's a kind king. I'd say so. It's happened before, actually, right over there. He nodded at the ancient palace of David. Jago, thanks for telling me all this. I understand what Paul was saying. It's almost morning and I need to get back to the fortress. I just have one more question. Jago chuckled and slapped at my shoulder. You always did have one more question, Lysias. What is it this time? You said that people who know Jesus should be king and won't accept him, they'll murder his servants. Jago nodded seriously. All the time, all around us. Servants like Paul? Jago looked at me gravely. Lysias, they've tried and failed twice in 2 days to do exactly to Paul what they did to Jesus. It's not Paul they're after. It's Jesus because they know he's alive. The fact that Paul, of all people, claims to serve Jesus when he used to hate him as much as any of them did. Well, Paul's conversion from star Pharisee to serving Jesus is one of the single greatest proofs of Jesus' ongoing life, short of seeing Jesus walk out of the tomb. Everyone knows it. In the council's world, Paul cannot be allowed to live. You have your work cut out for you, keeping him alive, if they haven't gotten him already tonight. We made hasty goodbyes, and I promised to return soon for another visit. As I hurried back up the streets to the fortress, Jago's words rang in my ears. Once you know Jesus is the true king, the real king, living King of Kings, you either accept his kingship or you keep trying and failing to crucify him so you can have his throne for yourself. You either make Jesus your king or you keep killing him wherever you find him, see? As Jago's lesson rattled in my tired brain, I kept seeing the same image flash in my memory. Not Jesus, but Paul. His back covered in scars, stretched out in my prison for yet another beating while I turned away in rage and listened for the crack of whips on flesh. When I arrived quietly back at the fortress and was admitted by the sentry on duty, I returned to my chambers. there was a message waiting for me. It was from the centurion I'd left on duty. "Commander, urgent. The prisoner Paul's relatives in the city have uncovered a plot by the Jews to assassinate him tomorrow. The Jews have bound themselves with oaths and will not rest until he is dead. I have investigated and verified. Come see me at once." Epilogue. I mobilized half the garrison to ultimately escort Paul safely to Caesarea, where he would stand another, more formal trial. Being a brilliant lawyer and knowing he would be assassinated the moment he was out of Roman protection, Paul evaded all of the Jews' efforts to get him back into Jerusalem. He wrangled a legal deal to appeal to Caesar himself, ultimately requiring his safe passage to Rome as a prisoner. Paul was kept in house arrest safely in Rome for years, where he served Jesus faithfully and wrote detailed letters explaining Jesus' kingdom, writings which flourished to this day, and I expect much longer. However, Jago proved to be correct. Those who would not have Jesus as king can only live in an effort to keep killing him and discredit his servants. As Jesus' kingdom expanded, so did his perceived threat to lesser kings. The new Roman emperor, Nero, would ultimately have Paul's head only a few years after Paul had enjoyed safety in Rome. Frustrated by their failure to kill Paul, the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem turned on other followers of Jesus, including James, Jesus' half-brother. James was thrown by the council from the temple and beaten to death, not far from where I had rescued Paul. His death brought to light the unquenchable fury the Jews had toward Jesus. Their flaunting of Roman law in executing James drove a wedge between Rome and the leading Jews, which would ultimately prove to be disastrous for Jerusalem. Jago, as a growing leader in the community of those who followed Jesus Christ, now derided as Christians, was inevitably imprisoned, where he died, like many other Christians, in Jerusalem. And I, Claudius Lysias, once the tribune commander in Jerusalem, I completed my duty and handed off command of the garrison in Jerusalem in order to retire back to Rome. My encounter with Paul and my friendship with Jago had a profound effect on me, and it wasn't long before I too accepted Jesus as my true king. That was 7 years ago. Upon returning to Rome, I was open about being a Christian, as many new Christians were. Then Rome burned, and Nero turned on Christians. My people turned on me. Like Paul to the Jewish council, I had been the best among military officers. I represent not only a Christ most of them reject, but also what Christ would make them if only they would have him. I write this from my cell, but my condemnation is certain. As a known and once renowned combat soldier, I will be sent to the arenas. The crowds will roar in approval at the comedy of my death. But it's not me they'll be trying to kill. It's Jesus, my king. Jesus lives, and I'll be with him the moment I join him in death. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Lord Jesus, I'm yours. I'm coming home.